The Black Pyramid, a short story. The pedigree of Jordan Macklin was nothing less than a relation, on his mother's side, to the great Egyptologist Flinders Petrie. It was not a pedigree traded upon very often, but he had been to Egypt 4 times over 3 decades. It was something in his blood, but each time had been a worse experience than the previous. On the most recent occasion, the trip to Luxor was abandoned, largely due to a ticket storm and the overwhelming number of tourists. He doubted if he would go back again. The whole place was ruined. The well-preserved world, studied, described, measured and cautiously estimated by Flinders Petrie with love, was long ago defiled. He was describing this sad state of affairs to April Henning, the wife of Professor Henning, the mathematician, but she a keen Egyptology buff. She'd been to Egypt on numerous trips herself, but she seemed oblivious to its degradations and still bathed in its romance. It was largely a matter of money. She could pay to avoid the riffraff and pretend she lived in easier times. Things Egyptian, of course, have a steady following, and the professional field is sufficiently corrupt and its narratives sufficiently unsatisfying. The talented amateurs see it as an open domain. She rang Macklin, eager, hearing that he'd only recently come back, and she hoped to meet and hear his reports and impressions. The centre of her fascination was nothing less than the Great Pyramid itself. The fact that Macklin was related to Flinders Petrie gave him some authority in her mind. She traded upon it. She liked to relate to people that she had a friend, or a friend of her husband, Jordan Macklin, who was related to Flinders Petrie. Really, they'd say. Yes, she'd say, on his mother's side. The works of Flinders Petrie are probably unsurpassed in Egyptology. No works since, regardless of new technologies, have been as perspicuous and exact, as faithful to the facts. Macklin's connection was, moreover, through Matthew Flinders, the explorer who first mapped and circumnavigated Australia, an illustrious family. Archaeology, though, was not Macklin's absorption. Bludgeoned by tourists, he found himself more inclined to wander the streets and souks of Cairo, the textures of contemporary life. There are many Egypts superimposed: Pharaonic, Ptolemaic, Muslim, African, modern. In fact, he was tired of archaeology. He was not nearly as caught in its intrigues as April Henning. Had he been candid with her, he would have admitted to her that he hadn't been paying much attention to it all on his most recent trip. The first time he went to Egypt, he had a mind full of dusty theories. That swelter had gone. It was submerged under a layer of Coke cans, ticket stubs and rubbish. When he arrived at April Henning's, she told him with keen enthusiasm that she had invited Angus Carrow to join them. Angus, said Macklin, looking up. Angus Carrow was another type of local amateur Egyptologist. He had theories. A man with a long grey ponytail, he would commonly be described as an old hippie, but he had a PhD, some aspect of geology, and brought some rigour to the occult Egypt. He dismissed the flying saucers, but he dabbled in alternative timelines. Macklin didn't know him well. They'd met a few times. His company, though, would be more lively than that of April Henning, who fussed and name-dropped and liked to disappear into recollections about people Macklin didn't know. Angus, she said, was running late. "Were you able to spend long in the Queen's Chamber?" she asked. "There's a fake wall in the Queen's Chamber, you know, in the niche." And she related a story of how somebody she knew, and who Macklin didn't know, had bribed a guard once and was allowed into the closed areas. The Queen's Chamber, thought Macklin, is a claustrophobic hellhole, and he spent as little time in there as he could. He lingered the full 30-day visa in Egypt, based in Cairo. He went to the Great Pyramid, but the tourists were truly pestilential, and he quickly fled to some of the lesser archaeological wonders, and then into the countryside, into the agricultural zones along the river, to escape archaeology altogether. He sought out some authentic Egyptian village life and the authentic uncorrupted patterns of simple Islamic life along the river, unchanged for centuries. After Egypt, he went to Turkey and spent longer there. It was more to his purposes. But he did give April Henning a report on the Queen's Chamber, and he had another report for Angus Carrow when he turned up. The day he'd gone to the Great Pyramid, entering the structure through the so-called Robbers' Tunnel, along with an unseemly gaggle of tourists from every corner of the globe, much of it Euro trash, his attention had been caught by an Australian accent in the crowd. It was a woman in her late 40s or so, and she was explaining to someone some observation about the carving marks in the ceiling stones along the tunnel. This was El Mamoun's tunnel. The story was that El Mamoun and his men in the 9th century or so dug their way into the structure by carving a crude tunnel into the so-called Grand Gallery. But this Australian woman was proposing the opposite. The tunnel, she was saying, was not made to dig into the pyramid, it was made to dig out of it. She pointed out anomalies in the stones. Macklin found himself next to her. "Australian," he said. "Oh, hi," she said, acknowledging a countryman amidst the gaggle. Macklin invited her to explain her idea to him. Her idea was that El Mamoun entered the structure in the conventional way, but dug his way out, gouging a new tunnel in order to remove the loot. It defied the conventional accounts. She was a chirpy woman, travelling on her own. Her name, it emerged, was Siobhan. Subsequently, Macklin caught up with her a few times during the trip, and she'd accompanied him one day on a bus journey to the villages along the river. Inside the pyramid, she commented on the heat and the glaring lights. They came to a side tunnel which was closed with wire grates, and she pointed to its long descent into the darkness. "True black," she said. It was a term she used several times when they met up. The true black. In any case, small world, she lived in Perth now, but had grown up in the East. It was just to make conversation that Macklin had said to her, "I know this guy, Angus Carrow," and explained that Angus entertained alternative timelines. Angus, he knew, had his doubts about the whole El Mamoun story. "I know Angus," she said. "Oh, you know Angus?" "I used to go out with Angus," she then explained. Small world. After that, Macklin took Angus for granted in their conversation. "As you know," Macklin said, "Angus thinks the old King's List that goes back into prehistory reveals an earlier civilization." "I know," she said. "He was always going on about that." She also advanced, "Angus was into alchemy when I knew him." "Probably," Macklin admitted. This was an opening relevant to the term true black. Just as she cursed the glaring lights inside the pyramid, so she bemoaned the ambient glare of Cairo, a massive, monstrous city, obscuring the black of the night sky. She had plans, she told him, to join a tour far out into the desert with stargazers, to see the raw night sky, much as it was in ancient times. "But it's not the stars," she told him. "It's the darkness between the stars." There are many grades of darkness. There are many shades of black. True black purports to be true. Charcoal makes organic black. There is also the deep black of the eyes of Egyptian women, and there is the black of night between the circling stars. For esoteric reasons he couldn't fathom, and which she didn't explain, although Angus Carrow knew all about it, she said. She proposed that somehow the Egyptians had been involved in a quest to reproduce the supernal darkness. The pyramids, he was to understand, were devices to create, to capture some black essence. Macklin might have misunderstood, but the idea seemed to be that the Egyptians had, in the inner depths of their pyramids, sought to refine darkness into the blackest of blacks. People still think the air shafts in the Queen's Chamber are lined with constellations, she said. It was quite the opposite. Not the stars, the darkness between them. The day they took the bus out to the villages along the river was horrifically hot. The breath of an oven swept in from the desert. It was cooler by the river, but still stifling. It was better, though, than visiting touristed sites in the heat, and the day served as respite. The people in the villages took little notice of them. These people had different faces to the faces to be seen in the souks of Cairo. Their complexion was grey, dusty grey. They had steady eyes. They didn't have the eyes of people engaged in commerce. It was so hot they found a place to get right down to the river, and Siobhan took off her shoes and stepped through the mud to wet her ankles. Macklin had a handkerchief. He wet it in the river and placed it on the back of his neck. The mud was black. In fact, there is a long portion of the ancient floodland of the Nile Valley where the soil, the mud, the sodden earth, is a tincture of black to be seen nowhere else. Nile black, Egyptian black. It might be the same black as the black between the stars, but the whole planet these days glows, as Siobhan complained, with neon and halogen, and who sees the true colour of the night sky anymore? If black is a colour, that is, rather than the absence of it, its full absorption or its nascent state. The black mud Siobhan ran through her toes was compiled of eons of silt, the rich grit of Africa. It had a smell, the smell of the black of time, the black of a vast chronology that ends, who knows where, in a universal amnesia only hinted at in the extant lists of kings. When he was in Turkey, Macklin had a vivid and unwarranted dream about that day. In the dream, he took a handful of the Nile mud, squeezed it, smelt it, and then started eating it. It was the colour black he was eating. As they were on the bus back to Cairo that evening, the heat finally relenting after the departure of the sun's fireball, they went past the ruins of pyramids and mustabas, silhouetted against the sky. Angus told me about the Black Pyramid, Siobhan said at that point. Do you know about the Black Pyramid? Macklin said he didn't. There's a Black Pyramid, she said, in the desert somewhere, and it is so black that you only see it as a silhouette, a triangular hole of total darkness in the stars. Macklin was fairly certain that Flinders Petrie had known of no such pyramid. When Angus Carroll arrived, April Henning continued fussing. Jordan's just back from Egypt, she was saying, and then crossed to the subject of Zahi Hawass, the director of antiquities in the Egyptological establishment, who both her and Angus referred to as a nasty little man. Angus was pleased to meet Jordan again. He might once have been embalmed in fringe hypotheticals, but he was cheerfully sober these days and agreed that the tourists were a plague of biblical proportions. Did you see the air shafts, so-called? April Henning was asking Macklin. Were they open? Could you inspect them? They were sealed up last time I was there, but Beverly Haslop, she was there, only last year. She said they were open, and any notion that these air shafts in the Queen's Chamber were for viewing constellations and the like were undermined, as far as Macklin could tell, by the simple fact that they were crooked. He was happy to hear that Angus Carroll agreed. Carroll laughed. There were lots of nutty theories about the air shafts. He'd believed in quite a few of them himself over the years. They were probably all wrong. He was more interested, he said, in the objects found inside those shafts in the 19th century, including a sphere and a metal object, which had subsequently, and mysteriously, he said, disappeared. I met someone you know in Egypt, Macklin then said. Oh? Yeah, Siobhan. Siobhan? Said Caro. Yeah, Siobhan. Caro shook his head. I met a woman in Egypt, in the Great Pyramid actually, named Siobhan. She knows you. She said you used to go out together. Caro looked mystified. I don't know anyone named Siobhan, he said. In fact, I don't think I've ever known anyone named Siobhan. She said she knew you, Macklin said. No, Caro said, quite certain. Macklin gave a description of her and of True Black and of the Black Pyramid. No, said Caro, still quite certain. Isn't Professor Carlyle's daughter named Siobhan? Said April Henning. But Caro said no, it was Carolyn. It is too, she said, and in reference to what she took to be some case of mistaken identity, she said, how odd. It was odd. You know a bit about alchemy, don't you? Macklin asked Caro. Caro downplayed the fact he did. Alchemy, he said. Al-Chem. Chem is the ancient name for Egypt. It's the word for black, land of the black soil. It emerged that Caro had been with the same lady for over 15 years. Was Siobhan, whatever she might have been, a fantasist? Macklin gave Caro the news. There's a woman named Siobhan in Perth, he said, who claims to know you. Well, said April Henning, you don't know who you're likely to meet in the Great Pyramid these days. Caro was slightly intrigued all the same. There were things, he was sure, beyond the empirical competence of Flinders Petrie. April Henning reminded him again that Macklin was related to Flinders Petrie. Yes, I know, he said. Tell me more about the True Black, he said to Macklin. And he was just as intrigued by the idea of the Black Pyramid.